Hi, I'm Geraldine Gallagher and I'm the CEO of the Executive Coaching Consultancy, and this is our podcast Shifting the Needle. And today we're going to talk about neurodiversity. Now, as a coach, I reckon I must have coached many people over the years who are neurodistinct or neurodiverse. And the thing is, most of the time I wouldn't have known because it wasn't really common for people to identify. However, I've noticed actually, and I think it's a great thing, I've noticed a lot more people are quite transparent about being neurodistinct. And indeed, they are more likely to come out and say, perhaps even on LinkedIn. So it occurred to me, as a coach, we are trained very much in the art of asking open-ended, clean questions. And it means that we're quite good at working with neurodiverse people because we're not picking up on our framing of the world, but instead what we're doing actually is trying to reflect back to the individual we're coaching their framing of the world. And as a leader as well, I've recognised that that's actually a very useful skill, and in respect to working with people generally, but also particularly with neurodiverse people, where indeed it's very important to be able to tune into their world and way of thinking rather than our own world. So I'm delighted today to have with me Madelaine Verchere. Madelaine works for EY and she works in data strategy. However, she also co-leads the neurodiversity community at EY. And so, welcome, Madelaine. I'd just like to start by asking you, how did you get into being interested in neurodiversity? What triggered your interest?
Well, firstly, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And it's I always think it's a bit of an interesting journey, actually, because it all happened probably about 10 years ago when my younger son was diagnosed with ADHD. And I think at the time, I didn't have a clue what ADHD was at all. Will was the only one in his class. And I guess that began a journey for myself, my husband, our whole family, around how do we help Will become successful at school.
So how old was Will?
So Will would have been 8 at the time.
8.
So it was picked up at school. One of the teachers said to us, oh, something's going on, and they actually thought he was dyspraxic. So I think really fast forward maybe to about maybe 7 or 8 years later, and having been on a bit of a journey as to how to support Will through school, we were going through a particularly difficult time, and I found myself really not knowing really who I could talk to. And Will at the time was still the only person really in his class, and so there weren't a lot of parents that were in a similar situation. And I've been at EY probably about 15 years at this stage, and I heard that there was a newly formed neurodiversity community at work. And I guess I love EY. I think it's fantastically diverse, great company to work for, and people like there felt like my tribe. And so I went along to the community, and really I just started to meet people like myself with either kids that were in a similar situation, or people that were young in the organisation that were joining the workforce and really maybe not disclosing. So really that, I guess, was my introduction into our EY neurodiversity community. Interestingly, at the time, it was only about 150 people, and it was led by an amazing friend, I'd call her now, Grace Bolton. He'd just converted it from a dyslexia community, and she was looking really to try and sort of grow that community. And I guess because I've always been in some kind of a strategy role, I started thinking about, well, what can we do with this community? And I think today it's now about 3,000 people.
Wow.
So it started as a UK-led community, and now it's open to people around the EY world. So we're really proud of the community that we've built.
I think it might be helpful for our listeners and viewers to understand a bit more about what does neurodivergence or neurodiversity encompass in all its assortment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, neurodiversity, firstly, it's everyone. We all think,
Of course,
learn,
yeah.
and process information differently. So our brains is as different as our personalities. So if you were to think about neurodivergent, and some people don't like that term, so they might call it neuro-spicy or neurodiverse or neurodistinct, that really links to a smaller group of the totality that may have conditions related to traits, for example, such as ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and there's a sort of broader range. In comparison to what you would call is a neurotypical, which is the majority who may think, learn and process information in a more typical way, whatever that is. So I think the point is that you can almost think about neurodiversity as being everybody in the same way you think about biodiversity. You've just got a range of differences. And if you think about neurodiversity, what's really interesting is the societal average is 1 in 5. So you can start to think about why it really matters that we understand this. So, like, for example, the organisation I work in, EY, we're 400,000 people. So that's potentially 20% of your workforce, and that could be maybe the people you work with, or it could be a child, or it could be somebody that you manage. And the fact that we all think differently is actually a very good thing, but we're just learning a lot more about what that means today for our children as they go through school, and also what it means for us in the workplace, and how do we actually not think about that necessarily as a negative, but more about how we can get a lot of the positives that come from that.
Yeah, I like the idea that it's about embracing diversity rather than tolerating. It's actually embracing it and seeing some of the benefits, because I would imagine that being neurodiverse or neurodivergent brings with it a set of skills that maybe neurotypical people don't have. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think from what I understand when it comes to the World Economic Forum, there's a whole list of skills that they determine as being really useful for being a manager. Do you want to talk a little bit about how neurotypical people, neurodiverse people track across to those skills?
Yeah, well, I think maybe the first thing is to recognise that there's this concept of what you might call a spiky profile. So there are things, for example, if you're, maybe ADHD, for example, or dyslexic, things that you have got, it's really about the high and the low of the profile, and that tends to be when you might get your diagnosis. So I think there's no difference in anybody's IQ, for example. It's not about IQ, it's about the things that are the most challenging and the things that you're very good at. So it's probably fair to say that there are a lot of things that are associated as good skills with those types of profiles. So it wouldn't be uncommon, for example, for somebody with ADHD, for example, to have incredible, hyper focus. So, people think generally it's not about being able to control your attention. People would generally think that ADHD means that you can't concentrate. Well, in fact, it's actually not at all. It's about the fact that you can't regulate it. And so actually sometimes you can be so singularly focused, something they call hyper focus, to almost the absorption of anything else that's going on around. Now, that can be a very useful skill in its own right. So I think what we recognise is that there are different things that come with different diagnoses. So, dyslexics, for example, often can be very good at pattern recognition. So I think what we're starting to learn is a lot of skills that come with a lot of the neuro traits or diagnoses, and those are ones that we can take advantage of. But equally, there's also things that people can find extremely challenging. And those things generally are things that perhaps organisations or people are having to work extremely hard to try and get up to what an average person would experience. And so the high and the low is really what you're trying to really address. So if you can make some of the things that are difficult easier, you can get to those higher value skills. And a lot of those skills are really, really valuable to us to be successful in jobs that we do and within organisations.
So it strikes me that it must be really important, this idea that I said in my intro, I was mentioning that having been a coach for many, many years, not many people had identified as neurodiverse. So I would have been coaching what you say, 1 in 5, is it 20%, 25%?
That's the societal average, yeah.
20%. So I would have been coaching maybe 1 in 5 people, and they wouldn't have necessarily come out and said, I have ADHD, or, I'm autistic. And so I guess now the fact that there's much more transparency is very useful, because it allows employers to be able to adapt.
EY has done a terrific piece of a global study, actually. It's Neuroinclusion at Work study. So it was 2,000 people, so 1,500-1,600 people that were neurodivergent, and then we almost had a control group of about 500 that were neurotypical. And the aim of this research was really to basically better understand how neurodiverse communities or people can be successful in the professional work environment. But to look at it from a lived experience, but also to look at it from a skill proficiency perspective. And we did it with quite a lot of academic rigor, because we had 3 different academics across our Asia Pacific, EMEA and the Americas region. So it was really, truly globally representative. But some of the key things were coming out were that there was like a 30% higher proficiency in those World Economic Forum sort of top 10 skills, which is great, which, sounds really like fantastic. There's something to tap into. Absolutely. Here. Yeah. However, we feel there's a lot of hidden talent to try and unlock. And why is that? Is that a lot of those skills, actually, a lot of those groups actually don't really feel like they're very included in the workplace. So they may be in more individual contributor roles when, for example, they may be better, they may have other value. Some of the other things that we found were that there's a really, really high aptitude for the adoption of things like data and AI, particularly and Gen AI. So I think it was something like, maybe like more than 70% or 50%, sorry, I get my data points right, I think it's about 50% more likely to be faster adopters of data and AI technologies. Yeah. And if you think about how important that is. It's going to be, exactly, like today, like we're all transforming in all jobs that we do. So I guess what I'm trying to say in a clumsy way is that if those are the people that are going to be the drivers of AI and adoption within organisations, they feel the least included, they're likely to be the ones that will leave. So we're losing, arguably, the wrong people at the very wrong time. So I think, what we're quite keen to try and, I guess, help organisations see is there's a lot of untapped talent. And that's great for people that have a lot to contribute. And so, communities matter.
And so I guess the AI one, maybe this is just a cognitive shortcut, but I would have imagined that would be something that less neurotypical people would be good at. And the reason for that is because I've heard for years that companies like Google and Facebook deliberately have a policy of hiring people on the autistic spectrum. What's that about? Is there an association there between, presumably there is an association between that hyper-focus, or is that ADHD rather than autism, isn't it?
It's a really tricky one, isn't it? Because I think what we're trying to say is that there are definitely some of those profiles that lend themselves to be able to work and perform with that kind of work more naturally. But generally, it's about, do you create the culture and to attract those kinds of people into the right jobs you need? And sometimes we don't always get that right. So, for example, I know at EY a lot of work has gone on to how you recruit. Mm-hmm. So perhaps you're expecting somebody to give you a lot of eye contact, but actually that's not really relevant to the job they do. You need them to be actually really good handling data. Perhaps that's not so. So maybe we've got the wrong criteria by which we're recruiting. I know, for example, my eldest son's at university, and some of his friends that are very, very capable, but may have a dyslexic diagnosis, for example. Like, well, I'm not going to bother applying to any of the big four because I'll never get through their assessments, which is, so our brand isn't attracting people. So I think, what it's allowing us to do is to think about, are we attracting people with those profiles? How do we recruit them? Are we recruiting them in the right way? And then once they get into our organisation, and, we've successfully recruit people into our organisation, can they really thrive? And what do we need to put in place to help those people thrive? So And I think what's interesting, and the research showed us, is that for people to really thrive, you're in this whole manager lottery, which is, so I think when you think about people that are managers today, I mean, I think about myself, for example, the way I manage my team. I've learned so much from our younger son about how, you think and learn and process differently, that I've shed a lot of biases that I've basically had. So if somebody's not the most, outwardly overt, doesn't necessarily mean they can't do their role well. Or if someone takes a longer time to proofread a document, well, maybe that's okay. So I think what you find is that maybe more people in work are with more children and being diagnosed or late diagnosis. Managers are starting to understand and manage differently. And if you get a good manager who almost runs or leads neuro-inclusively, and we can talk a little bit about what that means, actually people do really well. And I think generally that doesn't really matter if you're neurotypical or neurodivergent. So I think what we're seeing is the manager lottery and educating our managers is where you get some of the biggest breakthroughs. And I think that's,
I can see that's
really
critical.
That's
and managing in an inclusive way. When it comes to neurodiversity, what kind of recommendations would you make to managers about, how they lead?
I think, we put together, so in the community, the great thing about, I don't consult on neurodiversity, that's not me, my day job's in data strategy, so all I can ever talk about is what I hear from this really enormous group of community, but we asked them a lot of questions. So we actually ran a virtual workshop of probably 120, 150 people from across our community. This is a couple of years ago, and we said, right, what does good look like? How do we figure out when we thrive? And so we've got tons of feedback. We've also done things like we've run an employee experience piece of work separate to that. But the feedback we get back is, firstly, understanding neurodiversity is absolutely the first thing. So, all the things I've said around understanding traits associated with diagnoses, that makes a difference. Being able to advocate for yourself, that makes a real difference. And I think typically people are quite good at saying when they're good at something, but they're not always that great at saying when things are difficult.
Yes.
And actually, if you think about, I was thinking about my colleague Grace. I remember her always saying to me, and she's a real high performer. She does well, but she was asked on an engagement that she worked on by the partner, can you proofread this proposal for a piece of work? And she basically had to have the courage to say, I can do it. She didn't. I can't remember if she did say she was dyslexic or not, and that's a very personal choice. But she basically said it's probably going to take me maybe 5 times longer. I can do it, but might take me 5 times longer than someone else in the team. But I'm a pretty good project manager, so I can do this instead of that. So I think it's about us starting to think differently about what you're not good at, and being able to feel. And I don't know if it's a cliche. I hope it's not. But that whole sense of the psychological safety, to feel like you can actually say, well, I'm good at these things, but I'm not so good at that. So advocating for what you need, for what you need, is probably important. I think there's, we also start to think about there's masses that can be really helpful for people around assistive technologies. It's incredible. I think we did another piece of research.
Do you want to just explain a little bit more about assistive technologies? Yeah. I hear that expression a lot.
Yeah, sorry, yes.
Just give me an example.
Yeah. So, Copilot these days, I would say, is almost an assistive technology, or read and write. So you can listen to a document, or you can dictate. So I remember when my son was studying for his exams, as an example, I was like, well, why don't you try... rather than trying to slog through writing your essays by hand, why don't you dictate it? Like when you talk, think about it that way. Or perhaps your revision should be talk revision rather than sitting on my own revision. So I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of technologies now that you can use. So read, write, dictate, Copilot, that actually are enormously helpful. And how you organise yourself. So that's probably.
So that's great. The technology is possibly more inclusive than people in some ways, because we're harder to change and I think, going back to what I was talking about, the generations, I've had friends and colleagues, people I know that have, their own children have been diagnosed with perhaps ADHD or autism or some other form of neurodiversity, and then it's made them realise that they too are, and it's been quite eye-opening for them to look back on some of the challenges that they got through without ever identifying. Is that something that we're finding as part of your community? Do you find that you've got people who have discovered their neurodiversity via their children?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's genetic, so it's not really probably that surprising, but you're absolutely right.
Genetic.
Yeah, so we definitely see quite a lot of that, actually. It's almost things start to make sense as to perhaps people's maybe journeys of life or career, whatever, when their kids do get diagnosed, and then people go on their own journey. And actually, in a lot of ways, I think I think about why we're really lucky that our community has grown so much. It's because we have so many of those people that you talk about that may either feel very passionately about, like myself. I mean, I just care deeply for the next generation of talent and coming through. And, as a parent, you get quite scared about what the future looks like. Yeah. But we're also the people that can make the biggest difference. So, the way you lead, the way you manage, it's almost becomes part of your culture. So I think a lot of those people that are diagnosing or maybe even identifying without the diagnosis, because there's problems with access and funding to that, they're the people actually that drive the change within companies, that change our biases, that may see people's strengths more and be more neuro-inclusive.
So on a practical level, is being more inclusive, I mean, obviously, as someone who believes in inclusive leadership, I think of that as being just don't make assumptions and always lead with questions. Is that a fair assumption to say that that's a good way of being with neurodiverse people, with people that fall into the neurodiversity category?
I don't know if I could generalise quite like that, because I mean again, I'm generalising with autism, but it wouldn't be uncommon. Some people actually say let me just say neurodiversity or neurodivergence rather than try and isolate any one group. But some people, you'd argue, actually really like you to be quite specific. Yes. They don't like open questions. So I think it's quite personal.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. Yes, I'd read somewhere that, in fact, for autism, that can be actually quite threatening to be asked a whole series of open-ended questions. In fact, really clear, simple instructions is a better. So what about the generation coming through in the workplace? What's your experience of their approach to transparency?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, you probably read a lot, don't you? Certainly in the UK, there's lots of talk about an increase in diagnosis, and I think the next generation are unapologetic and very self-aware. So I think it's not really surprising that they're coming into our workforce, and certainly I don't think it's unrealistic to say people expect you to understand it to a certain extent for the older generation. I wouldn't say everybody's very comfortable disclosing at all. And I think it really depends on the kind of culture of organisation that you've got, whether or not you create environments where people can not. And disclosure is such a personal thing. We ran a whole theme on it over the year. We run sessions for our community, and people sort of want to know, well, should you or shouldn't you? And I'm like, it's very, very personal. You have to really feel safe to do that, and you have to know your environment. But I think one of the things we do generally see is that if you disclose to someone, it doesn't necessarily mean to be the team you're working in. You get on a bit of a journey about understanding yourself and how you can begin to advocate for yourself, and just being able to talk about that, I think, is quite healthy. I mean, I'd like to think certainly in the teams I work in that actually it's more healthy to understand when people are at their best and when they're not, regardless of their neurodiversity, because I think even neurodiversity is only one part of them. This whole, I don't know if you know the term intersectionality, but we're more than one thing, not just how we think. It's our backgrounds, it's our environments, it's our culture. So I think, neurodiversity is one component of it, but being able to, I think, know when you work at your best and when you don't, and being in a team where you can kind of say that is probably a good starting point.
Which is really the essence of inclusive leadership,
yeah.
which is to really understand your team, what makes them tick, what makes them good, and what gets in the way, so that you can create, as you say, a psychologically safe environment where people can volunteer. And so it's excellent to see that there is more transparency, and I do feel that our generation perhaps can learn from the generation coming through.
Yeah.
Yes, in terms of being more open. And perhaps get rid of some of this terminology about the snowflake. It drives me mad, that particular description, because in actual fact, I think being vulnerable is incredibly brave, and being open and honest and candid. And I'd really like more people to get to have the benefit of being able to do so, and leaders to recognise the value in doing so.
Well, I think it's funny you say that, because I think, I was listening to one of our talent leaders, and one of the roles of the community is not just to create a safe environment for our people, but is to actually influence change in our organisation. So, we're here to, and we're very lucky at EY because we've got talent leaders that really do genuinely listen. But what they will be saying is that engaging your workforce is the most important thing you can do, and I think those scores are really low. I think there's some statistics I should probably know that are quite down. So, but we know when you've got a more engaged and inclusive workforce, you actually get more productivity. And I think essentially that's what we're trying to do. And I think maybe the neurodiversity piece and the skills piece is to say, it's great to be inclusive. Everybody wants for us to be inclusive, but actually the skills that come associated with those profiles means, they're the ones that we need in a very changing world. So I think maybe it's a little bit more, it's a good time to be thinking about those.
So with respect to the next generation of talent, what are some of the pathways from education? Because I think education's becoming more aware. So moving from education into the world of work, what are some of the pathways for neurodivergent people?
Yeah, well, I think that's the big challenge, actually, to be honest with you, is how do we create pathways right from, when you start at school, right into the workplace. And I think what you see is that in schools, and I don't think schools have it very easy at the moment, I think trying to fit a structured, quite a structured education system that has to cater for all, which sometimes isn't necessarily very inclusive for those kinds of children. And I put my own kids' experience of that. But I think what we want to do is try and improve that. So I think education is trying to look at what it can do in terms of understanding it and teaching more neuro-inclusively. And kids are getting more accommodations in schools. Then we see them going into, and for those that, there are now more opportunities, I think. So, for example, pathways, not everybody's going straight into university anymore. There are way more apprenticeships, which may suit more people in the way they work. So that's a good thing. But then once they get into the organisations, so I guess the key point is that you need to look at the whole pathway, and we need to be able to make sure that a child at every stage is able to have an open door, not a closed door. A lot of doors close for people quite early
in the work,
if you don't understand kids, and you look at the number of people that end up getting in trouble. So they start off, for example, as being disruptive in class, then they get into trouble, then they, their education
get excluded,
so and then next thing you know, and so that doesn't set them up on a positive trajectory. So I think the more we understand that in education, the more we can get those successful pathways. And I think
that assistive technology you mentioned, I guess that in schools, but then
too,
making sure that more organisations understand that at the recruitment phase. I mean, EY are already doing lots, and so I guess it's that percolating through organisations so that we don't miss all that potential that's out there in the workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we're starting to do is realise that there are a lot of different ways we can attract people into our organisation. It's not all just through degrees. It could be apprenticeships. It can be lots of different programs. So I think more organisations thinking about it that way.
And I think with AI, it really, really challenges the notion of some of the way we've been trained academically anyway.
Yeah.
So university degrees themselves are up for a challenge, perhaps the subject of another podcast.
yeah, and Copilot already. I mean, we did a piece of work commissioned with Microsoft. They commissioned us, and we've been seeing it in our own community. I mean, it's just a game changer. It's a game changer for a lot of people in terms of productivity anyway, but for neurodivergent people with those profiles, even more so. And even differentially. But yeah, it's going to be quite a changing world with the world of technology. So I think. Like you said, it could be a topic of a whole nother podcast.
Thank you very much, Madelaine. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.